Tracey Spicer. It's wonderful to have you here today because it's quite a milestone. We're sitting at the official conclusion of the 100 Days for Change campaign, although we're only saying official because we know that there's a lot of work ahead of us as well, which we're excited by. It was about a year ago we had the first conversation about this campaign. Did you think we'd be sitting here at this point, looking back with such an overwhelming response and engagement across Australia?
I have been stunned by the response from corporate Australia and individuals to the 100 Days for Change campaign. It has been thrilling to see the passion with which people have approached this project, but most importantly, the practical measures they've put in place. Everything from mentoring to sponsorship to domestic violence leave to even the broader change, changing the language that they use in the office to non-gendered language, thinking about the way they talk in front of their children about these issues. What I love about this campaign is the ripple effect. What's really stood out for you? What surprised you about this campaign?
Firstly, it would be, I suppose, the number. So we've had over 200 pledges, official pledges, but so many more organisations and individuals have said that they're using it as a catalyst. So I think the engagement across Australia has been overwhelming, and particularly, as you said, we've had a huge amount of diversity in terms of the creativity that people and organisations have really looked at what's important for us to do now. So it hasn't been one or two options, it's been quite, there are definitely themes, but quite different in terms of what's important for them, and also the amount of individuals compared to organisations. So we're just about probably level in terms of how many of each, and individuals within large organisations saying, this is really important for me to be creating change, and then organisations to support them with a more systemic change as well. In terms of the language, what are you noticing about the change of conversations that are happening now? We've got a lot of awareness raising, we've had that over the last year, but we're noticing a different tone in these conversations.
People are taking gender equality seriously in the workplace. That's what I've noticed over the past 3 to 6 months. And part of that is to do with the momentum created by big social movements in the last couple of years. We haven't seen such social change since the 1960s. So that's certainly what's underpinning it from a grassroots level. But the change I've seen in the last 3 to 6 months is at executive and board level, really taking it seriously rather than being dismissive of it or pink washing, which is what it used to be called. They are actively trying to take practical steps because they are finally convinced. They know it will be better for the bottom line. They know it will be better for their workforce. They know they'll get more millennials working for them if they have a better culture. So what we're seeing is not just change in policies and procedures and legislation. We are finally at the tipping point for that cultural change, where people are taking it seriously rather than being dismissive about, oh, language doesn't matter, words don't matter. They understand finally that words matter, and that's tremendously exciting. I love some of the individual pledges as well. Florence Drummond starting up Indigenous women in mining. She's a young woman, she's a real go-getter. Are you seeing quite a generational thing, Suzi, where there's an energetic passion for change amongst a lot of young people in the workplace, and that's encouraging executives to finally take the step?
It's interesting. I think we're actually seeing at both ends. We're definitely seeing the energy and the inspiration from the aspiring junior leaders. But what's also been very heartening is we've had a lot of CEOs, a lot of head of people and culture, a lot of people that are sort of leading this area in organisations connect with us and really wanting to check in as well, say, this is what we're doing. How does that compare with other organisations that you're dealing with? So we just did some work with Boeing Defence, and they really are doing some amazing work across. They've got a gender working group, and they've got a watchdog that they talk about in terms of really identifying change. And with all the initiatives to come to us and say, okay, this is what we're working on, what are you noticing are the real enablers? And that's been exciting because then we've been able to connect them with organisations like Northrop, a big construction organisation, and they've been working particularly around flexibility because, and we actually didn't have a lot of pledges around flexibility, which was interesting because it used to be the silver bullet. And Northrop has said, we've been working on this for years, but we haven't been able to make change. And now they're looking at what is the language around flexibility. There's real challenges in leading teams that are flexible. So how can we train our managers? How can we create the language and the accessibility so that it's not seen as a gender issue and it's not seen as a parenting issue, that it's more broad than that as well. And I think that's interesting when we start looking at some of the typical initiatives that were on the table before. Organisations are now saying, okay, how do we actually make it stick? And in terms of that stickiness, what do you see in terms of the initiatives that, because that can be quite difficult. You can be putting yourself out to challenge others, to challenge systems when it's actually not sticking.
Definitely. And I saw two really good examples of that with the 100 Days for Change. One was CBRE. I went out and spoke to some of their employees and they turned their business around when it came to the gender composition of their board in a very short period of time. And the energy in that room of the women in the workplace saying, I'm so proud to work for this company because they are taking gender equality and broader diversity and inclusion seriously. So that was very exciting. I could see that they were completely on board and that was something that was going to stick and was actually binding the whole workforce together. I also love the fact that some of the top law firms, King and Wood Mallisons, has put in place, for example, domestic violence leave. Now, even as recently as 2 or 3 years ago, it was a very brave company that would do something like that because it might risk some kind of backlash within the community. But now it's seen as something that's normalised, something that's good, and something that's positive from everywhere, from the grassroots to the top end of town. So it's very exciting to see the diversity of change that's happening, but also the way in which it's been welcomed by the workforce and the broader community.
Because that really does create culture shifts, doesn't it? And I think that's what we're talking about, is how do we create culture change? It's not just a policy, a process that's sitting at one level. It's actually creating change. We had a pledge from the Salvation Army, and even though it wasn't particularly around culture change, it was implementing processes and new policy. But what they actually noticed, that it was a unifier. And the conversation started to be more generalised. It wasn't just sitting in a policy section, it was actually what we do on a day-to-day. And a lot of the themes, as I said before, were about language. And I think calling each other and doing that work around the biases that we have as well. What do you notice about that starting to shift?
Do you know what I noticed from one woman who made a pledge? We often talk about unconscious bias when it comes to male managers checking their own biases, and of course that's important to have training in that, absolutely. But one of the women who made a pledge said, I'm going to be more conscious of my own unconscious biases. So we all have them, and we have to acknowledge that, whether it's gender, whether it's cultural, whether it's to do with people's ability or people's sexuality, we all have those inherent biases. And what 100 Days for Change has done is broaden that conversation to include everybody. Rather than saying it's you blokes, you all have unconscious biases. No, we all do deep down inside. So that was a real light bulb moment for me reading that woman's pledge.
We also had from the Australian Red Cross as well, a woman actually saying that I'm going to start looking at my own language, but then having the courage to start role modelling, calling out those norms that perhaps are not so helpful as well. We're hearing about the language shifts in conversations and in the corridor, the water cooler conversation, but also at a policy level. We had a wonderful pledge from the Department of Education where they were actually going to do a review of all their recruitment language and also with their policy implementation, but the communication of the words that they're using. So they're actually having that balcony view of what's the message that's coming through in our communications internally and externally. So I think we're starting to see that it's not just about what we do on a daily basis, but it's also how does that manifest into our brand and what that has actually stated as well. Have you noticed those changes too?
Oh, definitely, and that's brilliant. They're doing such a wide-scale review of that language. One of the pledges from a man that I thought was fantastic with the 100 Days for Change was he said that not only am I going to notice more the gendered language, but I'm going to actively call it out. And the way he wrote that in his pledge, you understood that it actually takes great courage to call that stuff out. Dr. Michael Flood writes about it really eloquently. He says it's really hard for men to break that code of mateship and to speak out about those things, perhaps outside of the group, perhaps to be a leader in this space. It does take great courage. So I love that that fellow was able to articulate that so strongly, knowing, look, I might be outside of the pack by calling some of this stuff out, but I think it's really important to do so. And I see that with my kids. They're 12 and 13, and I'm always encouraging them to call out stuff in the schoolyard. And it's really hard for them, but it's important. That's where the conversation's at the moment, and I think that's something to be celebrated.
It's those dinner party conversations where everything goes very quiet.
Yes!
But it's having the courage to continue the conversation. And I think people are becoming more receptive to it as well.
I think you're right, because Jamila Rizvi wrote her book, Not Just Lucky, last year, and in it she wrote, I know you don't want to be that girl who's always on the soapbox, calling things out. It's exhausting and it's hard. But I get the sense now that things have changed so much in just 1 year, it is much easier to call these things out. There's greater understanding and greater acceptance. Do you get that feeling of really exponential pace of change?
Absolutely. And I think as part of that, what we're seeing is that we're starting to shift the gendered or stereotypical roles that we're seeing in organisations. And we're seeing it across media. There's more of an appetite to start looking at what else can women be doing, what else can men be doing, so that the conversation is not so limited. So I think by really challenging that, Richmond Valley Council have a wonderful program called Try a Trade. And I think that's very interesting because we're starting to see organisations encourage a different way of looking at the roles and the trades and the, I suppose, the brand that people see in terms of gender. Where am I going to go with this, and how am I going to be seen to be able to do that? In the symposiums that one of the big themes that's coming through in 2019 is actually looking at non-traditional roles for different genders, so that we can start actually highlighting what else is possible, so that we don't need to be narrowed down, which I think in turn is going to affect language as well.
And I think it's wonderful that Women in Leadership Australia is focusing on that ongoing, because as you would know, Australia has one of the most gender segregated workforces in the world. So until we get more men into traditional female oriented roles and more women into traditionally male oriented roles, we will still see this segregation, which contributes to the gender pay gap, unfortunately. Where do you see 100 Days for Change going in the future with the companies that have made pledges? It'll be interesting to see what has happened, what changes affected over the next 6 months, year, 5 years.
Right from the beginning, we knew that 100 days was not going to be a finite campaign, because as we kept being told, Suzi, we can't make these changes and create where we want to be, this new reality, in 100 days. What was exciting about it, organisations said that this was an impetus, this was a door opener, this was a focus. We're talking about creating a 101-day report and actually connecting to our communities about this is what we're noticing, and to be able to keep on tracking the changes. So it's our commitment to stay connected, to really encourage the measurement as well of what they're noticing has been changing over time. We see our role is very important in being able to be that conduit to support organisations to keep on focusing on these changes, but really to highlight where are the enablers, what do the derailers look like, and how can we connect organisations with others so that those enablers can be spotlighted and we can really learn across sector, across organisations, across departments to keep the focus where we need it to be.
I love what you're doing, because we're not talking about what is the problem with women. Are they not pushing themselves forward enough? Do they not have enough confidence? What you're talking about is really analysing the structures that hold people back, whether it's women or marginalised communities within the workforce, or holding men back from female-dominated professions. And I love that you're looking at it from that micro level and the macro level to work out what changes need to be made for the next generation. So I thank you for what you do, and it's been such a privilege being part of this wonderful campaign.
The theme about not fixing women, as you know, we work very closely with Catherine Fox, and I'm very excited to be telling her that we didn't have a strong theme coming through about fixing women. And I think that shows as well that we're starting to look at it as a systemic opportunity as well. There was no theme about supporting women to be more confident. There was no theme about supporting women to change their presence. It was all about spotlighting what they're doing and really highlighting opportunities for women to step up, or for others to reach out and have the conversations about how to create that platform shift as well. But it was very encouraging that we're moving away from that fixing women view as well. Is that something you've noticed as well?
Definitely, and hasn't it changed dramatically in even 5 years? I remember there was a lot of narrative in federal politics about 5 years ago around about women not being suited for leadership, and that was in relatively recent history, but we have come a long way in those years. Catherine Fox has done tremendous work with her research and her book on this in changing the conversation around we don't need to fix women, we need to fix the structures holding women back, and that is a cause for celebration, that message has sunk in at a company level. Because as you said earlier, this is how we affect social change. Now, people spend a third of their lives at work, let's face it. So if we can change cultures within workplaces, that permeates out to the rest of the community and broader society.
And that's where we see we have a role and a responsibility, because that's where leadership development comes into it. And it's interesting to have a look at the programs that we offer, but particularly at the executive level. I don't think we've ever seen such a huge amount of women applying to do our courses at that high level. In the beginning, when we started this about 6 years ago, it was a real struggle to fill a program because we really wanted women at that C-suite or wanting to get into that C-suite. Now there's such an appetite, and organisations are actually tapping women on the shoulder to say, would you consider this? We see there's an opportunity here, we see potential, we want to support you with it. And it's great to see women also saying, look at me as well, which we haven't seen before as well. So having those conversations has made a difference, and I think it ties in really well with this campaign in terms of the appetite.
We should be tremendously proud of what you've achieved and what Women in Leadership Australia continues to achieve, not only through 100 Days for Change, but being a transformative force within the Australian workforce and society. So more power to you, sister.
And Tracey, it's been such a pleasure to be working with you on this program as well, because the awareness raising that you do works as a natural partner, I suppose, to the work that we're seeing now, to be able to take that awareness to the next level so that everybody can get on board with it as well. Did you see that natural pathway when you sort of said, yes, I'd love to be working with you on this?
Oh, I think they're very symbiotic missions, because we need to talk about these issues, raise awareness of it, agitate for change, but then also implement practical measures. I'm a really pragmatic feminist, and I think the only way to affect change is not just talk about it, but to get people to do things. And that's what I love about Women in Leadership Australia and the 100 Days for Change. It's a real grassroots, action-focused initiative, and it's borne tremendous results.
Tracey, 100 Days for Change has received a lot of attention, and we've been very excited because at so many different levels, organisationally and individually. And when we conceived this idea over a year ago, we actually didn't realise how groundbreaking and how unique this was. And I think it sort of built on the awareness raising, but also it seems to be a real unifier across sector and across Australia.
Yes, and some of the companies came back, didn't they, and said it was a unifier, for example. What I loved about the campaign from the get-go was, in a time of hashtag activism and people saying they're going to do something, or people saying we want change, this was something that was grassroots and practical and transformative for all types of companies: private companies, public companies, small companies, large companies, not-for-profits, individuals. You know, a whole bunch of organisations got on board. I'd never seen anything like it, so it is truly groundbreaking, and we need to see more campaigns like this. We need to see people walking the walk, not just talking the talk.
In the beginning, we noticed that organisations were holding back and think, oh, I don't want to put it out there that I'm going to be able to pledge this change and have this measurable in 100 days. In the conversations we had, they realised that it wasn't about what was going to be achieved in so much in the 100 days, but it was actually a unifier, but it was also a statement that this is what we're doing. And I think because they started noticing that some of the initiatives were huge, some of them were small steps as well, that we actually had that breadth. And that's very encouraging, because we need to be working at so many different levels.
And you had that messaging right from the get-go when you said it could be something small, it could be something big. And that was the response to me when people came up to me after, say, the symposiums or public events where I talked about 100 Days for Change. They said, oh, so can it be just something like I can mentor someone, I'll have a coffee with them once a week, and then I can build a mentoring program down the track? And I said, of course, you can do any change, no matter how small or large, because every change has an incremental and flow-on effect to everyone else.
And we noticed that particularly working with Transport for Victoria, because they actually had all their agencies involved, and it was the first time that they were bringing everybody together across Victoria, all the different forms of transport, to actually look at this one issue. And they have one of their programs called Driven Women, which I love. And it was actually interesting looking at what they're learning across the sessions as well. But also, when we brought them all together to talk about 100 Days for Change, I thought this is something that we can all work together with, which we haven't seen before.
Definitely. It's wonderful collaborative change that's good for everybody, and that kind of change is long lasting.
Thank you, Tracey, and we look forward to continuing to work with you throughout the change that we are creating now. We're going to be reaching out to everybody who's been part of it and thank them for their connection, for their diligence, for their commitment, and also ear to the ground, you know, what they're noticing now, and to keep the conversations happening. So we look forward to hearing your updates as well.
Yes, I look forward to remaining involved and hearing about all the wonderful changes and the exponential effect that happens in the decades to come.
Thank you.
Thank you.